"You are a burden!" my daughter screamed at me on her front porch in Frisco, Texas, shoving my suitcase onto the concrete like I was trash being taken to the curb. The neighbors pretended not to stare, the sprinklers kept running, and my 5-year-old granddaughter, Harper, cried from the doorway in her little unicorn pajamas, reaching for me while her mother, my only child, pulled her back inside and slammed the door in my face. I'm Linda. I'm 63 years old. And that night, the daughter I'd sacrificed everything for threw me out of the house I helped her buy. What she didn't know was that I'd been planning to leave her $3 million, past tense. Because the next morning, I wrote her a letter that started with 8 words. Dear daughter, about the $3 million inheritance. And by the time she opened it in her perfect suburban kitchen, everything she thought she was entitled to had already been signed away. If you are watching this, kindly comment the city where you are watching from and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story like this. Now let's continue. My fingers went numb around the handle of that worn suitcase. The Texas heat pressed against my back, but Madison's words burned hotter than any August night in the suburbs. Her husband Tyler stood behind her in the doorway, arms folded across his chest, not yelling himself but clearly backing every word she said. I don't want you here anymore, Madison shouted again, her voice echoing down the quiet cul-de-sac where perfect lawns stretched between identical houses. A man paused by his pickup truck, 3 doors down, pretending to check his phone while watching the whole scene unfold. Harper's small voice cut through everything. Nana, don't go. Please don't go. She tried to run to me, but Madison grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her back across the threshold. The door slammed. I heard Harper crying through the wood. I stood there for a moment, completely still, wondering if this was actually happening. Wondering if my daughter would open the door again and say she didn't mean it. But the porch light clicked off instead, leaving me in darkness except for the glow of the street lamps. I picked up my suitcase and walked. I walked past the carefully trimmed hedges and the trucks parked in driveways and the basketball hoops mounted over garage doors. I walked until my arm ached from dragging that suitcase and my heart felt like it might crack open right there on the sidewalk. I called an Uber from the corner, standing under the buzzing fluorescent light of a bus stop. The driver didn't ask questions when he pulled up to the cheap motel off Interstate 35, the kind with the flickering vacancy sign and rooms that smell like old cigarettes no matter how many times they've been cleaned. Inside that dim room, I lay on the faded bedspread and stared at the popcorn ceiling. The air conditioner rattled. Somewhere down the hall, a TV played, too loud, and I kept hearing Madison's voice in my head over and over. You're a burden. If you'd told me 10 years ago that my only child would throw me out like trash, I would have laughed. I would have said you didn't know my daughter, didn't know how close we were, didn't understand the bond we shared. But lying there in that motel room with $27 in my checking account and nowhere to go, I realized something. They had no idea who they'd just thrown away. To understand how I ended up in a motel with almost nothing in my bank account, but over $3 million in assets, you need to know who my daughter used to be, or maybe who I thought she was. You need to know what I gave up for her and what she forgot I gave. Madison was born when I was 24 and working double shifts at a diner in Dallas. Her father left before she turned 2, and I never asked him for a dime. I scrubbed floors in office buildings at night after my day shifts ended. I packed her lunches in brown paper bags and walked her to the bus stop every morning before catching the train to work. I said no to new shoes for myself so Madison could go on the 6th grade field trip to the state capitol in Austin. I wore the same winter coat for 8 years so she could have a laptop for high school. When she got accepted to Baylor University for nursing school, I cried in the grocery store parking lot because I was so proud and so terrified of how I'd pay for it. My husband, Gerald, came into our lives when Madison was 15. He was a good man who worked in construction and invested carefully. He loved Madison like she was his own. When he died 5 years ago from a heart attack, the life insurance policy he'd taken out paid for Madison's final year at Baylor and the down payment on her house in Frisco. I remember Madison's graduation ceremony in Waco. I screamed from the bleachers when they called her name. She walked across that stage in her cap and gown, and I thought about every meal I'd skipped, every extra shift I'd taken, every time I'd chosen her future over my comfort. Tyler stood beside me taking photos, barely acknowledging me except to ask me to move so I wasn't blocking his shot. After graduation, Madison and Tyler got married in a small church ceremony. They moved into an apartment while she worked at a hospital in Plano. I helped with the wedding costs. I babysat when Harper was born. I showed up with groceries when I knew money was tight for them. Then came my stroke. It happened on a Tuesday morning in my small apartment. I was making coffee when my left side went weak and I collapsed against the kitchen counter. The doctors at the hospital in Plano said it was minor, that I'd recover most of my function. But I shouldn't live alone for a while. I needed someone to help me with medications, to make sure I didn't fall, to drive me to physical therapy appointments. Madison sat beside my hospital bed and held my hand. "Of course you'll stay. With us, Mom," she said, her voice soft and caring. "Family takes care of family. We have the guest room, and Harper would love having you there." Tyler nodded from the doorway, though I noticed he didn't quite meet my eyes. When I moved into their house in Frisco, Harper decorated my room with crayon drawings of flowers and rainbows. She put a stuffed unicorn on my pillow and insisted I needed it to sleep well. For the first few weeks, Madison seemed genuinely happy to have me there. The shift happened gradually, like seasons changing. At first, Madison asked me to help with small things around the house. Could I start dinner while she picked up Harper from school? Could I fold the laundry since I was home anyway? Could I run the vacuum while she was at work? I didn't mind. I wanted to contribute. I wanted to prove I wasn't just taking up space in their home. I made meatloaf and pot roast and the casseroles Madison used to love when she was little. I folded tiny pink shirts and Harper's unicorn pajamas while watching cooking shows on their big TV. I helped with homework and read bedtime stories and tried to stay out of Tyler's way when he came home from his job at the insurance company. But Tyler's comments started creeping in like weeds through concrete. He'd sigh when he saw my pill bottles lined up on the kitchen counter. "Those medications from Walmart are really eating into our budget," he'd say, loud enough for me to hear from the guest room. He'd complain that I used too much hot water for my shower, that I left lights on, that I took up space in the garage with my old boxes. Madison began joining in. One Sunday after church, she pulled me aside in the Target parking lot. "Mom, when my friends from the women's group come over, could you maybe stay in your room? It's awkward having you sitting in the living room with us." I smiled and said, "Of course, no problem." But inside, something cracked. The worst moment came at a church potluck in Plano. Madison was talking to a group of women from her Bible study, and I walked over with my plate of deviled eggs. One of the women smiled at me and asked how long I'd been in town. Before I could answer, Madison jumped in. "Oh, Mom's just staying with us for a bit while she gets back on her feet," she said, with a tight little laugh. "You know how it is. Just staying with us for a bit, like I was a temporary inconvenience. Like I hadn't given her everything. I started staying in my room more. I ate dinner earlier so I wouldn't be at the table when Tyler got home. I did my laundry at odd hours so I wouldn't be in anyone's way. I made myself small and quiet and invisible, hoping that would be enough. But one night, lying in the guest room with the lights off, I heard them arguing in their bedroom. The walls were thin enough that their whispers carried. "We can barely keep up with the mortgage and Harper's daycare," Tyler said. "Your mom is draining us, Madison. She's draining us dry." "No," Madison whispered back. "I didn't sign up to be her nurse. She should have saved money like a responsible adult instead of spending everything she had on. I don't even know what." I lay in the dark with my hand over my mouth so they wouldn't hear me cry. They truly believed I had nothing. They thought I was broke, desperate, dependent on their charity. That was their first mistake. What Madison and Tyler didn't know, what they never bothered to ask about, was what happened after Gerald died. They knew about the life insurance policy that paid for college and the house down payment. What they didn't know was that Gerald had been investing carefully for years, buying rental properties in Austin when the market was low, putting money into accounts that grew quietly while we drove old Toyotas and shopped clearance racks at Target. 3 weeks before Madison kicked me out, I met with Henry, my financial advisor from Houston. We had a video call on my tablet while Madison was at work and Harper was at school. I sat in that guest room and listened while Henry walked through the numbers. 3 rental properties in Austin, all paid off. Tenants covering taxes and maintenance with plenty left over. An investment account that had grown to just over $3 million. Gerald had set it up in my name alone, trusting me to manage it if anything happened to him. I'd never told Madison about any of it. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I'd lived through poverty. I knew what it felt like to count pennies and skip meals. I couldn't bring myself to spend money on expensive cars or fancy vacations when I'd spent so many years with nothing. I clipped coupons, I bought store brands, I wore clothes until they fell apart. Madison saw my habits and assumed I was poor. She never asked, she just assumed. During that video call with Henry, I told him I wanted to make sure everything was in order for Madison and Harper. If anything happens to me, I said, I want Madison to be taken care of. I want Harper's education fully funded. I want them to have security. Henry made notes and said he'd review the will. We'd set it up years ago with Madison as the primary beneficiary, Harper as secondary. Standard estate planning for a woman with 1 child and 1 grandchild. Everything's ready, Henry assured me. If something happens, Madison will inherit everything. She'll be financially set for life. I thanked him and ended the call. At that moment, I still believed in my daughter. I still thought her coldness was just stress, that her comments were just the strain of juggling work and motherhood. I told myself she'd remember who I was eventually. I told myself she'd remember what I'd done for her. I was wrong. The explosion happened on a Wednesday evening. Madison came home from the hospital in a mood I could feel from 2 rooms away. She slammed her purse on the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of wine without saying hello to anyone. Tyler was, already irritated about something, scrolling through bills on his phone with his jaw clenched. Harper sat at the kitchen table coloring, oblivious to the tension building in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. I was in the kitchen preparing chicken and rice for dinner, trying to be helpful, trying to stay out of the way and be useful at the same time. Madison walked past me and opened the refrigerator, stared at the contents, then slammed it shut. "Mom, did you buy this brand of milk?" she asked, holding up the carton. "Yes, it was on sale," I said quietly. "Harper doesn't like this brand. I've told you that." "I'm sorry, I forgot." Tyler looked up from his phone. She forgot a lot of things lately, like how much her medications cost us every month. I felt my hands start to shake. I can contribute more to expenses. I have some savings. Some savings? Madison's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Mom, you have nothing. You've never had anything, that's why you're here." The words hit me like a slap. Harper stopped coloring and looked up, confused by her mother's tone. "That's not fair," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not fair?" Madison's voice rose. "What's not fair is that I'm 38 years old and I'm basically taking care of 2 children. I work 12-hour shifts at the hospital and come home to cook and clean and take care of Harper. And now I have to take care of you, too, because you didn't plan for your future." Tyler stood up, adding fuel to the fire. "We're drowning here, Linda. We can barely afford the mortgage. And you're eating our food, using our utilities, taking up space we could be renting out if we were smart about it." "I help around the house," I said, hating how weak my voice sounded. "I cook, I clean, I take care of Harper." "You're not a babysitter, you're a burden," Madison shouted. "Oh, wow. You're a burden we didn't ask for and can't afford." That word hung in the air like poison. Burden. Harper started crying. I started crying. Madison's face was red with anger and something else. Something that looked almost like disgust. "I think you need to leave," Tyler said, his voice cold and final. "We love you, Linda, but this isn't working. You need to find somewhere else to stay." Madison didn't contradict him. She just stood there, arms crossed, nodding slowly. Tonight, Madison added. I need you to go tonight. I can't do this anymore. I stood in that kitchen, the place where I'd made countless meals for them, and felt the floor drop out from under me. But where will I go? That's not our problem, Tyler said. Madison walked to the guest room and came back with my suitcase, already packed with my clothes. She must have done it earlier while I was at physical therapy. She'd planned this. She carried it to the front door and opened it wide. The evening air rushed in, warm and thick. Mom, I need you to leave. Now. I looked at Harper, who was sobbing at the kitchen table. I looked at Madison, who wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at Tyler, who stood with his arms crossed like a bouncer removing someone from a bar. I walked to the door. Madison shoved the suitcase onto the porch. You're a burden, she screamed one more time, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I don't want you here. Harper broke free and ran to me, wrapping her little arms around my legs. Nana, don't go. Please don't go. Madison pulled her away. The door slammed in my face. The porch light clicked off, and I stood there in the darkness, alone. The Uber driver who picked me up that night was a young woman who asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, just needed a place to stay for the night. She recommended the motel off I-35, said it was cheap and clean enough. I thanked her and tipped her with some of the crumpled bills from my wallet. Inside that motel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my purse. $27 in my checking account. Credit card nearly maxed from medical expenses. A life's worth of sacrifice reduced to numbers that said I had nothing. Except they were wrong. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos. Madison as a baby, sleeping on my chest. Madison at her high school graduation, arm around me, both of us smiling. Madison on her wedding day, holding my hand before walking down the aisle. The photo from the day they closed on the house, all of us standing in front of the sold sign, Madison holding Harper as a toddler, me in the background, holding the sign itself. I'd been holding them up their entire lives, and the moment I needed them to hold me, they dropped me. The grief I felt in that moment was enormous and suffocating. But underneath it, something else was growing. Something cold and clear and absolute. I'd spent my whole life putting Madison first. I'd planned to give her everything I had, even after her cruelty. But there comes a moment when love stops being about sacrifice and starts being about boundaries. I dialed Henry's number. It was late, but he answered on the third ring. Linda, everything okay? No, I said, my voice steady, despite my shaking hands. Everything is not okay. Henry, we need to talk about my will. What about it? I need to change it, immediately, tomorrow. There was a pause. Linda, what happened? I told him everything. The months of coldness, the overheard conversation, the explosion that night, the door slamming in my face. I told him about Harper crying for me, and Madison calling me a burden, and Tyler saying I was leeching off them. When I finished, Henry was quiet for a long moment. Linda, are you absolutely certain about this? Changing your will is a big decision. Maybe wait a few days, see if... No, I interrupted. I've waited long enough. I've been patient enough. My daughter made her choice, Henry. Now I'm making mine. All right, he said slowly. Tell me what you want to do. I took a deep breath. Remove Madison as primary beneficiary. Set up a trust for Harper that Madison can't touch. Education, healthcare, down payment on her first home when she's older, but managed by a neutral trustee, not Madison. Okay, what about the properties? Into Harper's trust, all 3 of them. And the investment account? I thought about the women's shelter in Dallas I'd passed on the way to the motel, the place with the sign offering help to women with nowhere to go. I thought about the senior care fund at our church that helped elderly people who'd been abandoned by their families. Split the remaining cash between Harper's Trust, the First Methodist Senior Care Fund, and the Dallas Women's Shelter. I want it divided evenly. Henry was taking notes. I could hear him typing. Linda, this is permanent. Once we do this, you can't undo it without Madison's cooperation. And given what you've told me... I know, I said. I want it permanent. She doesn't get to throw me away and still inherit the life I built. I'll have the documents ready by tomorrow afternoon, Henry said. We can meet virtually and get everything signed. Thank you. Linda, for what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. I hung up and sat in that motel room, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Control. Power. The ability to decide my own story. Madison thought she'd thrown away a poor, dependent mother. She had no idea what she'd actually done. The next morning, I met with Henry over video call. He walked me through every document, every clause, every detail of the new trust structure. I signed electronically, my fingers shaking slightly as I scrawled my signature across the screen. By noon, it was done. Legal, binding, irreversible. Madison was no longer my heir. She would get nothing directly. Harper's future was protected, but Madison would never touch a penny of my money. The properties she thought would be hers someday were going into a trust she couldn't access. The $3 million she didn't know existed would go to people who actually valued compassion and family. But I wasn't done yet. I sat at the small desk in that motel room with cheap stationery I'd bought from the front office. I pulled out a pen and began to write. Dear Madison, I started, then I paused. No, not Madison. Daughter. Dear daughter, about the $3 million inheritance you thought was coming to you. I want you to know that until last night, you were my sole beneficiary. Everything I had was meant for you and Harper. The rental properties in Austin that you didn't know existed. The investment account that Gerald and I built over 20 years. All of it was meant to give you security, to make sure you never struggled the way I did. Past tense. Because as of this morning, you will inherit nothing. Let me remind you of some things you seem to have forgotten. The life insurance that paid for your nursing degree at Baylor? That was your father's sacrifice. The down payment on your house in Frisco? That was his gift to you, the countless nights. I worked double shifts so you could go on field trips and have birthday parties and never feel poor. That was my love. You called me a burden last night. You said I didn't plan for my future. You said I was draining you. What you didn't know is that I've been supporting myself this entire time. My Social Security goes into a separate account. I have assets you never asked about because you assumed I had nothing. You saw my thrift store clothes and clearance purchases and decided I was broke. You never considered that I was simply careful with money because I knew what poverty felt like. I forgave you the moment you slammed that door in my face. But forgiveness doesn't mean rewarding cruelty. Your daughter, Harper, will be taken care of. There is a trust in her name that will fund her education, her health care, and help her buy her first home. You cannot touch it. It's managed by a trustee who will ensure she has what she needs. The rest of my estate is going to places that actually help people instead of calling them burdens. The Senior Care Fund at First Methodist, the Dallas Women's Shelter, places that would have taken me in without making me feel like trash. This letter isn't revenge, Madison. It's protection. Because the truth is, I can't trust you with the fruits of my sacrifice anymore. You've shown me exactly who you are when someone needs you. I hope someday you understand what you lost. Not the money, but the mother who would have given you everything. With love, despite everything, Mom. I read it 3 times. Changed a few words. Read it again. Then I sealed it in an envelope, wrote Madison's address on the front, and walked to the post office down the street. The postal worker asked if I wanted tracking. I said no. Some things you just have to let go and trust will reach their destination. 2 days later, my phone rang. Madison's number flashed on the screen. I didn't answer. She called again. And again. She left voicemails that shifted from angry to panicked to desperate. I listened to each one, then deleted them. On the third day, a text came through. "Mom, please call me. We need to talk about this letter." I responded with one sentence. "There's nothing to talk about. It's already done." She called again immediately. This time I answered. "What do you mean it's already done?" Madison's voice was high and strained. You can't change your will without talking to me first." "Actually, I can," I said calmly. "It's my will, Madison. My money, my choice." "But we were your family. Tyler and we were counting on that money for Harper's future." The irony was almost funny. "Harper's future is fully secured. Her trust will give her everything she needs." "A trust I can't access?" "Mom, that's insane. I'm her mother. And I'm your mother. How did that work out for me?" Silence on the other end. Then, "I was stressed that night. I didn't mean what I said." "You meant every word, Madison. And you know what? I believe you. I believe that in that moment, you saw me exactly as you said, as a burden, and that tells me everything I need to know. Please," she whispered, "can we meet and talk about this?" I thought about saying no. I thought about hanging up and never speaking to her again. But I also thought about Harper and the years ahead and the possibility, however small, of some kind of relationship. "All right," I said, "we can meet. But the will isn't changing, Madison. That's final." We met at a quiet park in Dallas the following Saturday. Madison sat across from me at a picnic table, looking smaller somehow than she had a week ago. Her eyes were red from crying. She'd brought papers with her, documents she'd printed out, about reversing trusts and estate planning laws. "Mom, please," she started. "I know I hurt you. I know I said terrible things, but you have to understand how stressed I was. Tyler and I are drowning in bills, and I thought—" "You thought I was making it worse," I finished. "You thought I was a financial drain because you never bothered to ask about my actual situation. You just assumed." "I'm sorry." She was crying now. "I'm so sorry, but that money was supposed to be mine. Dad left it for me." "Your father left it to me," I corrected gently. "He trusted me to decide what to do with it. And I've decided." "But Harper? Harper is fully protected. She'll have everything she needs for a good life. What she won't have is a mother who can use her grandmother's money without accountability." Madison's face crumpled. "You can't do this. You're punishing me for one bad night." "This wasn't one bad night, Madison. This was months of disrespect. Months of being made to feel small in a house I helped you buy. Months of listening to your husband complain about my existence while you said nothing to defend me." She covered her face with her hands. "I didn't know you had that much money. If you'd known, you would have treated me better?" I asked. "That's worse, Madison. That means your love is conditional on what I can give you." She looked up, desperate now. "What can I do? How can I fix this?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. "You can be a better mother to Harper than you were a daughter to me. You can teach her that people's worth isn't measured in dollars. You can show her that family means taking care of each other when it's hard, not just when it's convenient." "That's it?" Her voice was hollow. I never get the money? The trust can't be changed without extraordinary circumstances. Even if I wanted to change it back, which I don't, the legal structure prevents it. I made sure of that." Madison stood up, shaking. "This isn't fair." "Neither is calling your mother a burden and throwing her into the street," I said quietly. "But here we are." She walked away without another word, I watched her get into her car and drive off, and I felt the weight of 38 years of motherhood settle on my shoulders. I'd given her life, raised her alone, sacrificed everything for her future. And in the end, she'd shown me exactly how much that was worth to her. Not enough. 3 months later, I'm living in a comfortable senior apartment community in Dallas. I play bridge on Tuesday nights and volunteer at the women's shelter on Thursdays. My rental properties in Austin still generate income. My investment account still grows quietly. I'm not wealthy in a flashy way, but I'm secure in a way that matters. Harper's Trust is managed by a trustee Henry recommended, a woman who specializes in educational planning. She sends me updates every month about how the account is growing, about the plans being made for Harper's future. Someday, when Harper is old enough to understand, she'll know her grandmother made sure she'd never want for anything. Madison calls occasionally. The conversations are brief and awkward. She asks how I'm doing. I tell her I'm fine. She doesn't ask about the money anymore. I think she finally understands it's gone in a way she'll never get back. Last week I attended Harper's school play. Madison had invited me, her voice careful and formal on the phone. I sat in the back of the auditorium and watched Harper play a tree in the school production of some fairy tale. She was wearing a brown costume covered in paper leaves, and she was perfect. After the show, Harper ran to me and hugged me tight. "Nana, you came!" "Of course I came," I said, holding her close. Madison watched from a distance, not approaching, not interfering. There was something in her expression I couldn't quite read. Regret, maybe, or just the realization of everything she'd lost that night she threw me out. People who call you a burden often forget they're standing on foundations you built. They forget every sacrifice, every late night, every time you chose their needs over your own comfort. And when they finally realize what they've lost, it's sometimes too late to get it back. Would I change what happened if I could go back? Would I take less offense, accept Madison's apology, restore her inheritance? I've thought about that question a lot over these past months. The answer is no. Because that night on the porch taught me something crucial. Not everyone deserves access to your love just because they're family. Not everyone deserves the rewards of your sacrifice just because they share your blood. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is establish boundaries that protect both your dignity and your legacy. My daughter kicked me out and called me a burden, so I left her the truth in a $3 million inheritance letter she'll never cash. And I built a new life where I'm valued not for what I can provide, but simply for who I am. That's worth more than any amount of money.